So today, as we present the Dr. Robert L. Kincaid Endowed Research Program, and I have to tell you that Dr. Kincaid was a former president of Lincoln Memorial University, and his family has endowed our research center in the Lincoln Library and Museum. We're delighted that they have been a part of this process. And now we have the occasion to have a lecture that will focus on one of the things that the Kincaids have great interest in, and that's the influence of the Judeo-Christian ethic on our society during Lincoln's time. And so today, we celebrate this program that the Kincaids have endowed, and we are honored to have with us Dr. Ronald C. White, and you'll hear more about him soon. Thank you for being with us. Enjoy this day because it is a full day, as you will see in the schedule. Later on this afternoon, there will be opportunities to visit with Dr. White, and I know you'll want to take advantage of that. And he has indicated to me today that there have been previous occasions when we tried to get him here and didn't make it work. So this time it worked, and we're delighted it did. We thank Tom Mackey for his leadership in that effort, and thanks to each and every one of you for being here today.
By way of introductions, thank you, Dr. Dawson, and it is good to see this room filled out. I haven't seen it like this since we had the Celtic group Four Leaf Pete in here several years ago. So no one is singing. All right, let's get that across right now. With my voice, no, you don't want to hear that. No. Cindy can, not me. I want to welcome you all to this lecture sponsored by the Dr. Robert L. Kincaid Endowed Research Center. Really only recently started. We've already started to provide scholars and research projects to explore the role and of the importance of the Judeo-Christian ethic in the life of Abraham Lincoln and in the larger political, social context in the age in which he lived. Today's presentation is a part of that process. Dr. Robert L. Kincaid was an educator, author, scholar, was really one, not only was he president here, but he's really one of the heavy hitters in getting this collection into national size. His name is on many documents throughout the archives in bringing in special collections into this museum. I think you would have enjoyed this particular program very much. Now, for introducing our speaker, I met Dr. Ronald White at my first McMurtry lecture in Indianapolis, Indiana. I got there by accident. My children were living up there, and I realized, oh, the McMurtry lecture is here. So I left my family, went to the lecture, because I recognized Ron White's name. I just finished his book, A Lincoln Biography. And I was really intrigued by it, because I could tell he was really trying to wrestle with what was Lincoln thinking, how was he wrestling with the ethics of his age, his faith. And he was one of the first ones to publish a lot about Lincoln's journey, his travels. And I was intrigued at how he did that one. And while there, I realized he also wrote the book, Lincoln's Greatest Speech. Ever since then, I decided I've got to have him on the LMU campus. So I've been looking for a reason to get him here. Finally did it. Thank you for coming. I was interested because, you see, shortly after I came to LMU, I got cornered by a visitor who said, I want you to tell me for certain, is Lincoln a Christian or not? Now, just like being in Scotland when I was a kid, when toughies would ask me, do you root for the Rangers or the Celtics? That's not a sport question. Is Lincoln a Christian? Not a historical question. It is a question of identity. It's a loaded question. So I simply copped out and says, I don't know. Lincoln didn't tell us, that's all I ever said. And I was interested very much in the research that Dr. White represents. in this field of how does religion, Christianity, impact our daily lives or the lives of the past? How can the historian read that? How can the historian grasp that? It's a problem because you have to thread your way through rocky ways. Either you go one side and you say, there is nothing there is no faith, or the other side, and you go too far and you get civic religion. And Dr. White threads between these two rocky outcroppings quite well, trying to find that way, and yet he does it for a general audience. You don't need to be a specialist to read his books. And we have them for sale, by the way, in the bookshop. Dr. White's a graduate of UCLA and Princeton Theological Seminary with a PhD in religion and history from Princeton University. He has studied at Lincoln Theological College in England, appropriate, and was awarded the Honorary Doctorate of Humane Letters from Whitworth University. He has taught at UCLA, Princeton Theological Seminary, Whitworth University, Colorado College, Rider University, and San Francisco Theological Seminary. Dr. White is the author of A Lincoln, a Biography, published in 2009. And this was actually awarded the New York Times, Washington Post, and Los Angeles Times bestseller. The book was also honored as a best book in 2009 by the Washington Post and the Christian Science Monitor. His Lincoln biography won the Covenant Christopher Award in 2010. He's also the author of Lincoln's Greatest Speech, which is being featured today. This book was honored as a New York Times Notable Book 2002. Upcoming, I believe he has the biography of U.S. Grant titled, right, Ulysses S. Grant, American Ulysses, is that right? Coming out in 2016. I got a feeling that will be on our short list next year. Dr. White has lectured at the White House, has been interviewed on PBS NewsHour, and is a fellow at the Huntington Library, visiting professor of history at UCLA, and a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum. He lives with his wife Cynthia in La Canada, California. Ladies and gentlemen, we introduce Dr. Ron White.
Wow. Thank you all for coming at 10 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday. I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank Dr. Dawson, Tom Mackey, who has just followed through meticulously with hospitality. I've known by reputation for years Dr. Earl Hess, one of your own, who is one of the preeminent Lincoln scholars. I've been learning this morning from Dr. Michael Tooley of your two great courses on Lincoln. I think universities and colleges today sometimes struggle for what is their identity. I commend you. I have the feeling perhaps when every student walks in the class the first time, maybe they don't think this is the class they want to take. I have a sense this is something so special to this university. In recent years, Abraham Lincoln has become, I would call him the leader for all seasons. The Ken Burns Civil War public television video is now being shown once more. 2009, we had the bicentennial of Abraham Lincoln's birth. I was invited by the State Department to give lectures in Germany. And I recall the first stop was Hamburg. I spoke at the United States Embassy, and they invited 12th and 13th grade teachers who taught English and history to come. And after they asked me a variety of questions, I said, may I ask you a question? I said, why do you in Germany teach and learn about Abraham Lincoln? And one woman stepped forward and offered quite a profound comment, I thought. She said, well, we know American history, and believe me, they do. Do we know German history? I doubt it. They know American history, and she said, well, we know the story of George Washington, and we know the story of Thomas Jefferson, but they are to us well-born, like many of our forebears in Germany, aristocratic. The reason that we are so attracted, she said to Abraham Lincoln, is he seems to us to represent what America is all about. We like Lincoln's phrase, the right to rise, that one can start anywhere in the United States and rise with little education, with little ancestral background, become an important person. How many of you saw the movie Lincoln? I've seen it 6 times. I took my grandchildren there. Think about it. This is a Hollywood movie without sex and pyrotechnics and violence. 154 speaking parts. It's a movie about ideas. And I was just pleased that it seemed to capture people of all ages. So there's many windows by which we can approach Abraham Lincoln. Politician, lawyer, humorist, president. I want to approach him today by looking at this remarkable address, the Second Inaugural. This is going to be very interactive. I want to ask you a question. How many of you have been to the Lincoln Memorial? Some of you have. I hope others of you will have that opportunity. You will recall when you go there, you walk up those steps. The Park Service visitors tell us that it's the second most visited place in Washington, second only to the Vietnam Memorial. When you get to the top of the steps in a very noisy city, all of a sudden people are very quiet. You walk into what I call that temple space. There is that tall Daniel Chester French statue of Lincoln. Most people are looking to the left, to the Gettysburg Address, carved on one panel. On the right, carved in 3 panels in Indiana limestone, is the Second Inaugural Address. Now, would some of you who have been there say back, just in a word or two, what was your feeling or what was your experience when you were there at the Second Inaugural? Just a word or two, just speak it out. What would you say? I'm listening. What was your feeling or experience when you encountered that Second Inaugural? It's even more powerful at night when you see it lit up. Anybody?
Moving. Moving.
Moving.
Humbling.
Humbling.
Reverend.
Reverent.
He said that?
He said that. The word I've heard the most, I haven't heard it yet this morning, is awe or awesome. What I want to emphasize here this morning is that we can find something humbling or reverent or moving or awesome. It doesn't necessarily mean we understand it. When I was a student at UCLA, I sang in the a cappella choir. The director was Roger Wagner, who founded the Roger Wagner Chorale, now the Los Angeles Master Chorale. Our junior year, we sang Bach's St. John's Passion. It's a very moving experience. I was moved to tears when we finally concluded that final chorale. Wagner, who was a larger-than-life figure, said, well, next year we're going to do something more difficult. We're going to do Beethoven's Missa Solemnis. But a few days later, I recognized that as much as I enjoyed that music, as much as many people think that Lincoln is the greatest leader of America, I didn't really understand that music. And I think that many people don't really understand Abraham Lincoln. They simply appreciate it. So my effort is to try to write for a general audience where we can understand more of who this person is. I so appreciated talking with Dr. Toomey in terms of his class, where we begin to see, as I want to emphasize too, that Lincoln is a person who grows, who changes. Early on, often his humor could hurt. His satire could bite. He grows into this magnanimous person. Lincoln delivered the Second Inaugural Address on March 4, 1865. 25 to 35,000 people were in attendance. Here's another extra credit question. This was the first person inaugurated for a second term since, who was the previous president?
Jackson.
Andrew Jackson. Oh my goodness, you get an A. So this was an unusual event. It was a dark, rainy day, windy, muddy. People came from actually all across the country. I learned after I wrote my Lincoln's Greatest Speech book, I was often asked the question, how many people could hear this address? Well, the ancient amphitheaters in Turkey are built to accommodate 8,000 to 9,000 people. And later I learned through 2 newspaper correspondents that about 8,000 to 9,000 people could have heard Lincoln. He was a practiced public speaker. Not the speaker of Disneyland with a baritone voice, but actually with a tenor voice, and often so nervous when he began he almost shifted into a falsetto. Lincoln delivered this speech. The audience that came that day, I expected them to be there with a great sense of jubilation. Anybody here been to an inauguration? Several people have. It's a very exciting event, especially if it's your candidate. And this is the thought that I had, they would be jubilant. Then I read the letters and diaries of the people who were there, and I was very surprised by what I learned. For in those letters and diaries, there was a deep sense of anger. Anger. Why would people be angry at an inaugural address? Well, think about it. Almost everyone there had lost a father, husband, son, brother in the Civil War, and they were angry at the South, and they wanted Lincoln to express their anger. In World War I, we banished the teaching of German in all of our public schools. In World War II, we banished the Japanese from every part of the Pacific coast and moved them inland. This is what we do in times of war. And when Lincoln offers this speech of magnanimity, it took people by surprise. Another interesting part of the context of that day were the people who were there. The audience was filled with soldiers. And as people wrote in their letters, they were shocked by the sight of these soldiers. 3/4 of Civil War surgery was amputation. And so here were these soldiers, amputated arms and legs. This was the audience that was there that day. After the address, Lincoln received a congratulatory note from his New York friend, Thurlow Weed, and Lincoln wrote back and said, "This is my best effort." I didn't come up with the title, Lincoln's Greatest Speech. I wanted the title to be Lincoln's Sermon on the Mount, because that's what the newspaper reporter said the next day, but you don't get to choose your own titles, I learned. So Lincoln's Greatest Speech, Lincoln said, "This is my best effort." But then he added, "But it's not immediately popular." Dr. Toomey's going to moderate our question and answers, and I told him, I get the first question. If Lincoln thought this was his best effort, why did he also say, "But it's not immediately popular"? That's the first question. All right, I've handed out the text. I want to work through this text together, 701 words, and see if we can go a little bit from awe to understanding. I know you have a lot of understanding in this university, but let's look at the Second Inaugural together. At this second appearing, to take the oath of the presidential office, there is less occasion for an extended address than there was at the first. This is not exactly 7 years ago. There's nothing in this first sentence that immediately says to you or to the audience then, let's get prepared for something quite remarkable. In fact, I would say that the first paragraph is so different than what we have been hearing in the Republican debates and what we will surely hear in the Democratic debates. It goes against every stricture of modern leadership. The modern politician is promising us everything he or she is going to do for us. I will do this, I will do that on my first day, in my first hour. Lincoln takes exactly the opposite approach. Let's look carefully. In the first sentence, he says there is less occasion for an extended address. 7 lines down, over to the right, he says little that is new could be presented. In the final sentence of the first paragraph, no prediction in regard to it is ventured. What an unusual way to begin an address, to tell the audience what he is unable to do, what he is unable to predict. So like Abraham Lincoln. In the second paragraph, we begin to get a sense of what is the purpose, what is the direction of Lincoln's address. Lincoln is always asking a question of himself or his audience. He spoke very seldom publicly outside of Washington. He traveled to Gettysburg, I think, early so he could listen, talk to the wives, mothers, sisters, fathers. And he's asking himself a question that no one is asking. Not the politicians, not the professors, not the ministers. And the question is this: how can the South be brought back into the Union? And he recognizes that if the South is meant to bear alone the shame and the blame, they will never be allowed back into the Union. And after his death, 1 day later, his own Republican Party wants to shame and blame the South, And the history that goes forward is in many ways the South not really joining the Union. A remarkable young woman, female scholar, has written a book recently on Kentucky, in which she argues that Kentucky joined the Union, and in the next 12 months, when the war was over, it joined the Confederacy. And this is Lincoln's question. How will he answer it? His rhetorical strategy begins with what I call inclusive language, his use of inclusive language. Let's listen. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it. All sought to avert it. The end of the paragraph. Both parties deprecated war. Lincoln is doing what modern politicians seem absolutely unable to do, to credit the best possible motives to those who are his opponents. He may not agree with their ideas, but to credit the best possible motives to those who are the supposed enemy. So he is saying the South did not want this war any more than the North wanted this war. In his use of the words all and both, which will continue throughout the address, are his remarkable ability to use what I call inclusive language, which means we're all wanting to be good Americans. We're all wanting to be patriotic Americans. I hope we can hear that today. We may disagree on ideas, but all of us want the same goal. Now Lincoln, with only about 1 year of formal education, boys were expected to work on the farm outside, and so their only possibility of education would be in the months of January and February when it was too cold to work outside. And so families would sort of hire itinerant teachers, and Lincoln received either 10 or 12 months of education. He read his first grammar book when he was either 21 or 22. It was a book for adolescents. I'd like to have modern adolescents read this book. And half of the book was what was called declamation. Declamation, do you know what declamation is? Declamation is public speaking. So the last half of that grammar book would have been selections from the Bible, from Shakespeare, from the great poets of the era, and Lincoln early on became a practiced public speaker. One of his tools, this is an extra credit question. I remember asking this question in Phoenix, Arizona, and there were two 13-year-old girls sitting in the front row, and they had just studied this in class. What is alliteration? Can someone tell me what alliteration is? Yes?
It's when you begin an idea with the same letter.
Same letter, same
Like-
consonant.
Yeah.
So let's listen to Lincoln again in this second paragraph. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it. All sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war. Well, the first 13-year-old girl answered the question correctly. As I was going forward, the second one leaped out of her seat and said, "Do you mean to tell me that Abraham Lincoln decided in advance to use the consonant D 8 times? I said, "No." But he had a sense of what I would call the musicality of words. I learned after my first Lincoln book that the way Lincoln would write, and I commend this to you who are students, he would often say the word out loud before he would put it on paper. Read your paper out loud. Have a roommate or a friend read the paper out loud, and you will hear things that you will never hear if you read it to yourself. Do you know that children in school always read out loud until some day in the 1930s? It was a hot day in Tennessee or California, and about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a teacher, frustrated, said, "Johnny, please read to yourself. You're destroying Mary's concentration." And we've taken up this terrible habit of reading silently. I remember once we were vacationing, I spent a year studying in England, and we stopped at this inn, and after dinner we were sitting in this large kind of a living space, and people were all reading out loud. This is what people did. This is the way they understood. And we've adopted exactly the opposite practice of reading silently, and therefore we miss it. Lincoln says he read with two senses, the sense of the eye, but the sense of the ear. And so alliteration was very important to him. If you have only 272 words at Gettysburg, or 701 words at the Second Inaugural, Lincoln's second rhetorical strategy was to take the same idea or word and repeat it over and over and over again. What's the noun in the second paragraph? It's really the basis of, you can imagine the conversation that day at this Second Inaugural, that Lincoln just keeps repeating over and over and over again. What is that word? It's the word war. 7 times as a noun, twice as a pronoun. If you look carefully and step back a bit, the word war, I would suggest, is both a direct object grammatically, but also historically, of the action of the soldiers, the generals, and of Lincoln as commander-in-chief, until we get to the final sentence. It's like the final chorale in Bach's St. John's Passion, where he suddenly changes the key. And that final sentence, and the war came. By the way, of those 701 words, 501 are one syllable. Recently, there's been a huge debate in the SAT as to whether students could or should write essays. A lot of students have complained about this. Readers have complained that students can't write essays. And the readers have said this fascinating comment, that students believe that if they could use big words, that would somehow impress the reader. Lincoln uses 501 one-syllable words. He loved what he called the Saxon Bible. It was the King James Bible, but he didn't call it the King James Bible. He called it the Saxon Bible, because Saxon is strong one-syllable words. Latinate are different sorts of words. An English poet, in reading the Gettysburg Address, supposedly tossed it to the ground when it came to the word proposition, because that's not a Saxon word. Lincoln loves strong one-syllable words. The word war. Now, you've been working with this just long enough to ask the question I want to ask. How do you think Lincoln said that final sentence of the second paragraph? We have 9 photographs from Alexander Gardner of Lincoln delivering the Second Inaugural. Obviously, we don't have any audio of him delivering the Second Inaugural. Edward Everett was the greatest orator of the day, president of Harvard. He was traveling the country giving speeches on George Washington to get funds to restore Mount Vernon. I can imagine, and Edward Everett spoke for 2 hours and 7 minutes. 2 hours and 7 minutes at Gettysburg before Lincoln spoke. I can imagine that Edward Everett would have said something like, "And the war came." But I don't think Lincoln said it that way at all. How do you think Lincoln might have said these final 4 words of the second paragraph? Anyone?
Regretfully. Regretfully.
Regretfully. Wonderful. Regretfully.
Sadly.
Sadly.
Dread.
Yes. We thought for more than 100 years that the casualty total of the Civil War was 620,000. You probably would still find that in many textbooks. And just a few years ago, a demographer at a state university in New York began to work with the census data. And he looked at the census for 1870 and he compared it to the census of 1860. These were mostly young men fighting in this war. And he has now revised that total forward from 620,000 to 750,000 dead in a tiny nation of barely more than 30 million. That would be as if there were 5 million dead in Iraq and Afghanistan. I must admit, I don't know about you, I don't know a single person who has died in Iraq or Afghanistan. I remember speaking in Manchester, Vermont. Robert Todd Lincoln built a summer home that became his home in Manchester. In the tiny town of Manchester, you could take the tiny towns of Tennessee, 29 young men went out to fight in the Civil War. Only 13 returned. I once led a group of young adults to Poland. We were sitting in Krakow at a church meeting for lunch, and I was talking to the people, and I looked around, and I noticed that all the people there were women. And unfortunately, naively, I said, well, I'm grateful that you were all here. I said, where are the men? And this woman looked at me and she said, there are no men. She said, there are no men. All the men of our generation are dead. There are no men. She shouted at me. Did I not understand? Well, this is what it would be like to have lived through the Civil War. The male flowering of that generation were all taken away, sold, and bored. When we turn to the third paragraph, we begin to get Lincoln's sense that he is describing something almost like an historian or a sociologist. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. If we had a text with all of his additions and subtractions, he originally wrote southern half of it, but he wanted to be very sure that the South did not have half, it had part. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. A huge debate is still taking place about what was the cause of the Civil War. The Pew Charitable Trust, right on the eve of Fort Sumter in 2011, put out a survey across America. What is the cause of the Civil War? And it was very interesting to see the way people answered that question. Only the people over 65 answered that slavery was the cause of the war. The youngest group, 18 to 29, were all over the map. It was if they did not know what was the cause of the Civil War, as if they were ignorant about the Civil War itself. These were the people who had just graduated from college, but they didn't understand very much about the Civil War at all as they tried to answer the questions of this survey. It was very illuminating. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this history was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union even by war, while the government claimed no longer the right to restrict it. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration. Neither is another inclusive word which is already taken. Neither anticipated that the conflict, the cause of the conflict might cease with, or even before the conflict itself should cease. Each side looked for an easier triumph, and a result less fundamental and astounding. And then I want to suggest Lincoln makes a turn, a shift, as it were, in his address when he says, both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. Lincoln is now moving from a political address to an address filled with theological language. And the question that kind of undergirds our presentation and conversation today and throughout the day is Lincoln simply using the Bible as people would use Shakespeare in that time? Is this simply a kind of cultural practice that Lincoln takes advantage of? Some of our finest Lincoln biographers, one of them simply says, this is not even Lincoln's language. He's adopting the language of his audience. This is not his own. Or is there something more profound here that Lincoln is suggesting? First of all, notice the inclusivity. Both read the same Bible. The Confederate soldiers read the Bible every bit as much as the Union soldiers read the Bible. The most surprising place of my research for Lincoln was to travel to the American Bible Society in New York City. And in their magnificent archive, they have all of these Bibles carried by Confederate soldiers and Union soldiers. Where very quickly they realized that you couldn't carry a Bible with you if you were an infantry, so they published 14 different portions of the Bible, the Gospel of John, some of the Psalms, Proverbs, Galatians, whatever it might be. Both read the same Bible. When Gettysburg decided to inaugurate the first national military cemetery, they had to collect from the 50,000 dead, wounded, and missing soldiers all of their belongings so that family members could come. Diaries, letters, watches, money. What they chiefly found were Bibles. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and then a semicolon. Oh, the semicolon is dropping out of our language today. Oh my goodness, we are shortcutting, abbreviating everything we can do to do away with the English language. If you get nothing else of what I said today, it is this: Lincoln believed in the English language and the gift of writing it carefully and clearly, and so should we. And when Lincoln takes after that semicolon, both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, semicolon, and each invokes his aid against the other, understand, Lincoln is really saying, how dare each side invoke God's aid against the other? Is this a tribal God? Do we worship a territorial God? Lincoln was tired of ministers and politicians who came to him to say, God is on our side, God is on our side. He knew that they were coming to Jefferson Davis to say, God is on our side, God is on our side. One such conversation, Lincoln leapt up and said, I would like to figure out how I can get to be on God's side. He then invokes these words: it may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. This is the first of 4 quotations from the Bible in the Second Inaugural. When I began my work on Lincoln, my Lincoln colleagues and academic friends said, don't get too excited. Lincoln is doing nothing more than what every American politician or president would do in an inaugural address: quote the Bible and invoke the name of God. Well, first of all, I discovered that yes, every single inaugural address, the name of God in different names is invoked, but always only in the last paragraph. It's almost like, and we need God's help too. What really surprised me was, did you know in the previous 18 inaugural addresses, the Bible had been quoted only one time? By John Quincy Adams, quoting the Psalms: unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Well, 3 months to the day before Lincoln delivered this address, 2 women came to him from the South. I struggled to find the antecedents of this address. If you want to find the antecedents of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, you can find them. He invoked those same words in other places at other times. He simply put it all together there in Washington, D.C. You cannot find the antecedents of this address in any previous speeches by Abraham Lincoln. But 2 women came to see him, and they knew that if they pled with him, women would plead with Lincoln with their tears that he might release prisoners or release Union soldiers who had been condemned to death. He wrote one Friday was Butcher's Day. He hated it. He just hated it. He wrote to one general, I believe this man will do better above ground than below ground. The man went on to win the Congressional Medal of Honor. So these 2 women from the South said, our husbands are religious men. Well, Lincoln, to their surprise, said, would you like to come back tomorrow and continue the conversation? He came back. They came back a second day. Lincoln drove his secretaries crazy with his style. He asked them to come back a third day, and then he said this to them: I find it very difficult when you tell me that your husbands are religious men. How can religious men go against the duly constituted authority of this country? And then he quotes these words: it may seem strange that any man should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. Genesis 3:19. Lincoln is saying to those of us who are believers in the Christian faith, the Bible is not simply back there and then, it's here and there, it's here and now. Your husbands are involved in slavery. He said, I don't think that's the kind of religion that gets people to heaven. And he dismissed them. Noah Brooks, who would have become his secretary in his second term, correspondent for the Sacramento Daily Union, was sitting out in the hallway. He said, Noah, come in here. I want to write down my conversation I just had with 2 women. Someday I want to use that conversation. And so he did. But then Lincoln, who, as we've been talking about earlier, could move from sarcasm and humor, began, I think, to think to himself, that sounds very, very harsh. Semicolon. But let us judge not, that we be not judged. Sometimes Lincoln is thought of as simply an Old Testament person who invokes the God of judgment or wrath. Quite opposite to that, he often invokes the New Testament. Here he is invoking Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7, verse 5, where he is invoking a new ethic. The Judeo-Christian ethic that is the heart of this lecture series is the point that if in the past we've had judgment, the new ethic is one of forgiveness. It's one of reconciliation. I wanted to call my book Lincoln's Sermon on the Mount because that's what a reporter called it the very next day. This was Lincoln's Sermon on the Mount. He caught the meaning of it. The prayers of both could not be answered, that of neither has been answered fully. And then this declaration, the Almighty has his own purposes. To me, this is the central declaration of the whole address. It's central architecturally, it's central rhetorically. The Almighty has his own purposes. Lincoln has many, many names for God, but the one he favors the most is the Almighty. The Almighty. Noah Brooks arrived in Washington, and the first Sunday he went to the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, which Lincoln began to attend with more and more frequency. And Noah Brooks was sitting in the balcony, and he did what you shouldn't do. When the minister said, "Let us pray," and everybody else closed their eyes, Noah Brooks kept his eyes open. And as he looked down, he noticed these Presbyterians, this is their typical posture of prayer, had bowed their heads with their hands folded, but there was one man who had stood. Pretty hard to miss this man. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall. If he entered the auditorium today, people were much smaller in the 19th century. He'd be 6 feet 9 inches tall. You would not miss him. He'd be great for the basketball team. And after the service, Brooks came up to him and said, "Pardon me," they had met before in Illinois, I happened to notice that you were standing during the time of prayer. And Abraham Lincoln said to him, "I stood and stand as a mark of respect." He said, "For me, God is always the Almighty. That's why I stood." One more turn of this address. Woe unto the world because of offenses. For it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. Matthew 25. The audience would have known, we may not know, but that audience would have known clearly as a Christian audience, that Lincoln is now invoking what the Puritans called a Jeremiad. In the second and third generation, the Puritan preachers harangued their audiences by saying, "You have forgotten the faith of your grandparents. You have forgotten the faith of your parents. Woe unto the world because of offenses." And the offense might have been materialism, it might have been immorality. What is the offense? The audience quickly wants to know. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses. Now here again, notice very importantly, if Lincoln would have said, if we shall suppose that slavery is one of those offenses, his northern audience would have cheered and applauded and said, that's the problem. It's down there below the Mason Dixon. They're the problem. But when he says American slavery, he is saying the entire nation is involved. Lincoln inherited a case where a slave ship owner from Connecticut had been condemned to death. Many of the slave ships traveled out of the north. The man's wife came to see Lincoln twice with her tears. Lincoln let the sentence of death go forward, and the man was hung for his crime of being a slaver, a slave ship owner. So American slavery is the offense. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South. Notice the inclusive language. This terrible war has the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in the living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope. Fervently do we pray. Do you hear the alliteration? Fondly do we hope. Fervently do we pray. Why do we use alliteration? Alliteration is it's an unconscious tether that links one's thoughts. We're not conscious of it, but it helps us to understand what a speaker is saying. Ministers use this, professors use this. It's a wonderful way of organizing one's thoughts. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. On the Sunday after Fort Sumter, Lincoln sat at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, and we have that sermon. And Phineas Densmore Gurley's sermon was all about the scourge of war. Where did Lincoln get that idea? Where did he get that word? This was the whole sense of Gurley's sermon, the mighty scourge of war. Yet if God wills that it continue, until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, until every drop of blood drawn with a lash, slavery, shall be paid by another drawn with a sword, 750,000 dead. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Psalm 19. Now, the reporter for the Times of London was observing this remarkable spectacle. Sometimes when you stand outside of your culture, you can see things more clearly. He had noticed, as did some of the American correspondents, that up to this moment there had only been 4 or maybe 5 occasions of applause. That's unusual. Think about that for inaugural addresses. And the reporter for the Times of London had noticed that there was a group of people there that day, in this muddy, rainy, windy day, who were gathered at the back of the crowd. But they were dressed much more colorfully than the 2/3 of the people dressed in the front. And when Lincoln offered these words, the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, he began, the Times of reporter listened, he thought he heard something. He craned his head and his ear, and he did hear it. It began at the back. And now he heard it clearly. Bless the Lord. Bless the Lord. The African Americans in the crowd took up this like a chant. Bless the Lord. Bless the Lord. And their voices came forward. Frederick Douglass, the greatest African American in the 19th century, was in the crowd that day. He had read Lincoln's first inaugural address, deeply disappointed. Lincoln said he would teach the fugitive slave law in effect. But Douglass got to know Lincoln personally in interviewing 4 years. He met him twice in his office in the executive mansion. He came to listen to what he heard that day, and he wrote in his diary that evening, this sounded not like a state paper, but like a sermon. Like a sermon. As we conclude, let me make this suggestion. This is a state paper. It's a political address, but it has something of the structure of a sermon. 19th century sermons, and I suspect 21st century sermons, often have at least 2 parts. The first is what I call the indicative. It's where the minister, priest, rabbi, says to the congregation, this is what God has done. This is what God has done in Jesus. This is what God has done in Jesus in the life, teaching, death, and resurrection. Lincoln's word is the Almighty has his own purposes. I don't know about you, but in the particular Presbyterian church where I worship in Southern California, when we get towards the end, the minister often becomes more folksy and does what I call the imperative and says something like this. Now, in the coming week, therefore, I ask you to live what? With more generosity, with more spirit of reconciliation, with a sense of forgiveness, whatever it might be. So I want to suggest as we close that we should put an unvoiced therefore before the final paragraph. The first 3 paragraphs are the indicative. The last paragraph is the imperative. And I thought for a long time, did Lincoln believe in this deeply divided nation that he could actually ask for forgiveness and reconciliation? We live in a deeply divided nation. Is it possible that we, students, faculty, friends of this university, would want to live our lives as agents of reconciliation rather than division, divisiveness, accusation, criticism? Now, Lincoln is a 19th century person. I'm an historian. I don't want to make him somebody he isn't. He can't help us with climate change. He's not going to have any word on the Iran nuclear deal. But he does offer us a spirit of inclusivity, a spirit of humility, a spirit of reconciliation. So I like to say to students that of all the people that you will study in this great university, from the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century, all of whom are important in your formation as in your education, there's only less than the fingers on one hand of people who are still speaking in 2015. Lincoln is that person. So may I suggest that we conclude together by saying out loud the final paragraph, because I think these words still speak across time and can still speak to us in 2015. Let's say these words together. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. White, very much. So glad to see so many students here today, especially the ones from Lincoln 100. Rest assured, we will be covering this speech in class. Those of you who are in Lincoln 100 obviously already know who I am. The rest of you, I'm Dr. Michael Toomey. I coordinate the Lincoln 100 courses here on campus. And so I'm sort of an amateur Lincoln historian. And I'm always grateful and in awe of those who are real Lincoln historians, such as Dr. White. Let's give him one more round of applause. I'm going to try and get as close to you as I can in the questions. I believe this microphone will reach at least halfway up. So while Dr. White is responding to the question, let me know if you want to ask a question. I'll get as close to you as I can. If I can't get the microphone to you, I'll repeat the question. We already know what the first question is going to be, and that one, of course, will go from Dr. White to himself. Why did he think it was not such an immediately popular address?
Well, I think Lincoln understood the mood of the audience. They were looking for a speech that was both triumphant, how wonderful we are. I meant to say in my comments that if you think about it, inaugural addresses were that way. Second inaugurals especially. Thomas Jefferson, oh, thank you so much for electing me a second time. I know that you understand what a great time I did the first one. But they're also really self-congratulatory towards the nation. When have you last heard a president dare to offer any criticism? Jimmy Carter tried to, and it hurt him very much. Abraham Lincoln did. He said to this nation, we have a great evil in the midst of us. It's this evil of slavery, and we're all accountable. And people didn't want to hear that. They wanted to hear a criticism of the South or a triumphal notion of the North. And Lincoln offered an address of magnanimity, and they weren't quite prepared to receive it.
All right, who has a question?
In view of what you said about Lincoln being a great orator,
Yes.
and having training in that, in your opinion, how much do you think that ability influenced the course of the war and the outcome?
Oh. Well, I like this. Thank you for the question. I think it's possible to say that Lincoln, in a sense, won the war in one sense with his words. You could say Winston Churchill led his nation through World War II because of his gift of words. Our leading Civil War historian, Jim McPherson, has posed the question, what if Lincoln was leading the South with his words, and Jefferson Davis, who was not articulate at all, was leading the North with his lack of words? So what worries me today is that we are downplaying the use of words. We are cynical about the use of words. Once upon a time, rhetoric was at the center of a college education. Now what is called speech communication, I don't know about here, is often put off to the side. It's an elective course. It's, well, take it if you want, and it's a technique course. I argue that Lincoln rose by his gift of speaking. This is how he won his first elections in Illinois, and that this served him well. His gift of words was able to enliven and to give energy to the nation.
All right, anybody else? All right. Just go ahead from there.
You go ahead.
I can repeat it too. Go ahead.
Well, I was just wanting to know if you would speak about the impact of, like Lincoln's spiritual,
Yes.
but the impact of like his own kids and like the loss of his kids.
If I would speak, you said spiritual, but then the loss of his kids. I like to say that Lincoln was on a journey, as you and I are. So Lincoln grew up in Kentucky and Indiana. He grew up in the context of the Second Great Awakening. His parents were Baptists. No disrespect to any Baptists here this morning. But Lincoln early on was turned off to the emotionalism of that experience. He would come out of church 9 years of age and get up on a stump and repeat the minister's sermons word for word, kind of mimicking the sermon until the father slapped him on the backside and sent him home. And Lincoln reacted strongly against that kind of religion and against emotionalism per se. He did what many young people did. He gravitated towards, in his time, the readings of the Enlightenment authors, and he became a skeptic. He became what I would call a fatalist, which is kind of a kissing cousin of deism. If there is a God, God is kind of a watchmaker God who doesn't really intervene. And my struggle with the Lincoln biographers is that they keep him as a fatalist throughout his whole life. But that's not true. Lincoln's first child, Eddie, dies in 1850 at age 3½. Lincoln seeks out the Episcopal minister who would marry him. He's out of town. So he discovers there's a new Presbyterian minister, James Smith, who's been there only less than 12 months. He invites James Smith in to do the funeral sermon for Eddie. Mary joins the Presbyterian church. What we miss in that story is when that church has a conflict with its local regional body called the Presbytery, they are represented by 3 lawyers. Lincoln is one of the 3. They would never have allowed him to represent him. He had not been affiliated, aligned with that church. Lincoln comes to Washington. He begins to attend the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. I think the missing person in the Lincoln story is Phineas Dinsmore Gurley, the minister of that church. #1 in his class at Princeton Seminary. Very thoughtful. When Willie dies, you notice, if you've seen the film Lincoln, Willie dies in 1862. You never want to say this about any child, but the boy most like the father. This just devastates Mary. Literally, she starts downhill for the rest of her life. Lincoln is so taken by Gurley's sermon, which we have, he asks Gurley for a copy of that sermon, and he carries it around with him. It's the most amazing sermon where Gurley is really tracing out in a funeral sermon the tension between free will and providence. So when Lincoln uses the word providence in the Second Inaugural, this is no more fatalist. This is not a fatalist. What is providence? Providence is the belief of Christians in a loving God with personality who acts in history. And the historians miss the point if they think fatalism and providence are on the same line. A book was written in 1859 on the heresies of the Christian faith. The author lists fatalism as one of those heresies because fatalism refuses to acknowledge this loving God. So Lincoln's on a journey. To answer the question that Tom asked, is Lincoln, well, that's a question that we don't quite have enough information on, but yet this address, with its attestation of 4 passages from the Bible, to me is Lincoln pointing to the surprise of his audience, because this had been a personal journey up to this point. This remarkable attestation, the Almighty has his own purposes.
This idea of Lincoln in national sin,
Yes,
or
yes.
the guilt that the whole American nation bears for sin. Nowadays, you don't ever, like you say, you don't really see a president ascribing some kind of great wrong or we're going to pay a great price. If you see that, it's usually a prominent evangelist of some sort who attributes like Hurricane Katrina to something or the 9/11 to something, and they're kind of labeled and marginalized as somewhat of a religious fanatic. Were there any reaction to Lincoln as like jumping off the deep end, saying that God was actually punishing?
Let me try to repeat what you said so well. The idea that Lincoln would attribute some sort of national sin or national guilt, that we don't hear that today. If we do, it's perhaps someone on the far right fringe. I would say it this way, that we have two different ways of approaching reality. One is an atomistic way. The reality is the individual. The Bible is about the individual. But the other way is to say, no, reality is really about a community. The Bible is about a people. And so Lincoln understands that there's a national role here for the United States, and he invokes this kind of attitude. Was there a reaction to it? Oh, yes, there was. One person wrote the next day, "This sounds like the tale of an old sermon." Another correspondent said, "He's crossed the line between church and state." So yes, not everybody was applauding at all. What I haven't said yet, and need to say, and who is the wonderful high school teacher who's written on the fragments. Yep. In the Basler collection of Lincoln papers, there are what we call fragments. These were little slips of paper, sometimes the back of a flap of an envelope, where Lincoln would write his ideas down. Oh, I wish we had more of them, but there's 140 of them in the Basler papers. And one of the most remarkable is the one that John Hay found right after Lincoln's death. He was rummaging around in the drawers of Lincoln's desk in his office, and he pulled out this little piece of lined paper. I've traveled to Brown University to hold it in my hand. Maybe they wouldn't let you do that today. It's 8 sentences. It's not dated. It's not titled. It's not signed, but we know it's Lincoln by the handwriting. And Lincoln begins by saying, "The will of God prevails. In great contests, each side claims to know the will of God. One must be wrong. Both sides cannot be right. It may be that in this contest," and I love this sentence, "God's purpose may be different from the purpose of either party, and yet God uses the human instrumentalities to effect his purpose." So what I'm arguing is that when I've been asked, and oh, I tell you how many times I've been asked this, Lincoln is not really religious, he's simply using religion as anybody would in the middle of the 19th century. Lincoln had been working this out privately. This was probably written in September of 1862. And finally he comes in March of 1865 and begins to say publicly what he had been working out privately. What he might have said the next 4 years? Gamblers in the street were betting he would be elected for a third term. There were no term limits, and served till March of 1873. So there's a deep sense of something happening here that Lincoln is now bringing to the fore. We can talk more about that.
Anybody else? Go ahead.
Dr. White, I was
Yes.
wondering, would you say that these scriptures that Lincoln was reading, if we have information on that,
Right.
during his struggle with explaining the Civil War, were more Old Testamental or Newer Testamental? As
Good question.
more of a, as the Old Testament focused on victory over enemies of God rather than the message of forgiving your enemies.
The question is, and the comment is, if Lincoln was reading scriptures, and we have several independent voices, a nurse that came in to be with Mary, the older sister of the boys that the Lincoln boys played with, who noted that Lincoln habitually, often at lunchtime, would take out an old Bible and sit there and read that Bible. What did he read? Well, he did enjoy the Psalms. He could quote portions of the Bible, whole portions, which people did in those days from memory. But certainly there's an Old Testament portion, but there's also a New Testament portion. In 1842, way back at the beginning, he's asked to give an address to the Washington Temperance Society. Temperance was a big movement. It had up till that time been a whole Christian movement. What was temperance all about? Lincoln was a temperate person because he believed that the person who gave himself to drink had lost a sense of self-control. That was what was so wrong with drinking. You no longer were in control of your own self. So he was against that. His great friend was William Seward. I love the Lincoln movie. These two guys really get along with each other. Lincoln would go over to Seward's house on Lafayette Square. What an odd couple. Seward had a liquor cabinet. I mean, it didn't stop. No, Lincoln didn't drink. Seward had profanity that didn't stop. Lincoln didn't swear. Just very different. But Lincoln was this person who understood that. Refocus your question. I just lost in my own statement. Say it again.
Do you, on the New
Oh, the scriptures. In 1842 at the Temperance Society, he actually criticizes the Christian reformers, people because they want to denigrate the so-called alcoholic or the drunkard. And Lincoln said, how in the world as Christians could we possibly do that? Isn't the whole meaning of the Christian faith to come alongside of someone as a friend, not as a critic? And he says, as we know, and then he's quoting from Philippians 2, that omnipotence deigned to make himself into a human being and to give himself on the cross for our life. Well, that's often overlooked too. That's way back in 1842. So Lincoln is on a journey.
All right, any other questions? Brooklyn?
You quoted a census saying that people over 65 think that
Right.
the cause of the war is slavery. With the younger generations, do you feel that it's more, we realize that the Civil War is more multi-layered than just slavery?
That's a fair comment. Yeah, good comment. She said I quoted the over 65. I was surprised by the result because I've had people come up to me and say, for goodness sakes, the textbooks from 50 years ago wouldn't have named slavery at all as the cause. But your comment's a good one, that maybe younger people realize that the causes of the Civil War, I like your term, are multi-layered, that there's a multi-layered notion of this. The point that was made then that evening by a white professor from the University of South Carolina was, read the secession documents. Read the secession documents. Every single one of them names slavery as a cause of why they are now seceding from the Union. But I can't answer the question why, but it was fascinating that we weren't quite sure of what are the causes of the Civil War, which maybe we're not sure of the World War I or World War II too. That may say something about our historical amnesia.
Any other questions? Yes. I want to ask one very quick.
Yes, yes.
And it has to do with his skill as a writer.
Yes.
I think when we consider how little formal education Lincoln had, it's just absolutely remarkable that he could pull off something like this and any number of other examples that you point to. And this may be a question that has no answer, but could you maybe just let us know your thoughts on how he gets to that point, that he can write so effectively?
Well, thank you for that question. I like to say to students and to all of us, there is no such thing as good writing. There is no such thing as good writing. There's only good rewriting. The last class I taught was a seminar at UCLA, and I think I shocked the students because when they turned in their first paper, I sort of said univocally, these are unacceptable. And I said, be honest, how many of you finished them at 2 o'clock in the morning? How many of you, this is a first draft? And then I like to teach seminars where part of the whole task of the seminar would be to rewrite that paper, to maybe get some new bibliography, to receive criticisms from fellow students as well as the professor. What I learned, and this is in my second book, The Eloquent President, is that Lincoln was a rewriter. And that we don't always have this, but we have sometimes multiple drafts of his speeches. The greatest story is this, and I'll close with this so we can move forward. Lincoln crafted his first inaugural. He knew he was a great speaker. He had done very well in the Douglas-Lincoln debates. They weren't called the Lincoln-Douglas debates. They were called the Douglas-Lincoln debates. And he asked 3 Illinois friends for their responses to his address. 2 of them said great, and gave a very insightful one-sentence change. He arrived in Washington. Seward had been the leading candidate, led on the first 2 ballots of the Republican convention in Chicago. Lincoln persuaded him finally to become his Secretary of State because Lincoln believed in appointing people smarter than he was. That's the whole point of leadership, smarter than you are. On that first Sunday, they went to St. John's Episcopal Church, and at lunch, he gave a copy of his inaugural address to Seward and said, "Sir, if you wish, I know you're a great speaker," and he was, "would you be willing to look at this, and if you have any comments, I'd be happy to receive them." Well, that very evening at the Willard Hotel, parlor number 6, there was a knock on the door, and here was Frederick Seward, William's son, and he said, "Sir, my father has read your inaugural address, and he has some comments." He handed Lincoln in an envelope 7 pages. He had numbered the pages in red ink, and Seward offered Lincoln 49 suggestions on how to improve the address. Lincoln accepted 27 of them. And then when Lincoln got to page 6, I wish I'd have been there to see the expression on his face, Seward wrote to him, "As for your last paragraph, forget it." Lincoln was going to end the address, "Will it be peace or sword?" And he reminded him that Thomas Jefferson, having succeeded John Adams, who had left town, he was so angry, Thomas Jefferson said, "We are all Republicans. We are all Democrats." He said, "You've got to end something like that. Here, I've written 2 new last paragraphs for you. You may choose which one you'd like to use." So Lincoln chooses Seward's last paragraph, but then as I show in my book, I take the 4 sentences, these are Seward's 4 sentences, these are Lincoln editing Seward's 4 sentences. How does he edit? Less is more. Again and again and again, he makes it shorter. He has a sense of sound. Seward begins by saying, "I close," and Lincoln says, "I am loath to close." He extends the meaning. And then you know, mystic chords of memory, that's Lincoln. The wonderful phrase, "the better angels of our nature." It's not Seward. Seward has an idea, but we wouldn't be quoting Seward here today. So Lincoln has this gift of editing, of revising. And I think that's often what's missing today. How many of you have pushed the send button and you wish you had not on your email? How many of you edit your emails? I doubt it. So I think this is something, and this is the great gift of being in university, where you can learn how to write, and you can learn how to rewrite, and how to edit. And Lincoln is really a model of this. It's wrong, you see, to say that Lincoln is just a genius. Oh, he just was great, and none of us can. No, Lincoln worked very, very hard at the craft of writing and the craft of speaking. He believed in the English language, spoken well and written well, and so should we. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. White. Appreciate it.